It is currently October 28th, so 3 days until Halloween, and also 3 weeks since I last posted a video. I wanted to do like a weekly consistent upload, but there were a few reasons why I did not reach that in the past 3 weeks. Number one, school is stressful and top priority right now. Number two, this project is taking a really long time. Number three, I've had a lot of like technical issues with getting the videos from my phone to my computer to my iMovie. But yeah, 3 more days till Halloween. This project was my Halloween costume for 2020, but clearly it is not going to get done in the next 3 days, and I've decided I am okay with that. I'm still very stressed about it. I wanted it to be done by Halloween. But also it's good. I don't work well with deadlines, so I'll have time to really work on the project and like make sure that everything is done the way I'd want it instead of rushing through things to get it done by a deadline. If you haven't seen my last 2 videos, the first one is about talking about the design process for this, and the second one is making mock-ups for this project. So if you want to see those, go check them out. But yeah, I'm going to be working on the Underbodice and the Chemise for my 1660s project. If you don't know anything about this project, if you haven't seen the other 2 videos, I'm going to be combining Plague Doctor, which I'll put there, with like a 1660s gown. But yeah, the whole idea is to create something that's really pretty and extravagant, but also spooky and Halloween. So starting off, this pattern looks a little bit different than in my last video. I retraced it onto a clean piece of paper so that all the lines are exactly where they're supposed to be. And I also took the side piece and cut it up into 3 sections. I did this since the bones are all facing different ways, so I thought it would be easier. Now moving on to the fabric for this project. The first layer is a canvas interlining, I think it's called. It's used for tailoring. I picked this one because it's sturdy, but also not super heavy. It's also lightweight, which is a bonus, so I can lay the pattern pieces on top and see through, which is really important so that I can trace all of these boning channels on. So while I'm laying it out on the canvas, I'm making sure to keep the grain lines straight. I didn't like the grain lines on the pattern, but I kind of knew where I was supposed to put them. And now I'm just going through with a white colored pencil and marking all the lines. I think they make like chalk pencils that are actually made for sewing, but I do not own one of those. So I just used a white colored pencil to get those fine details, which were really important with all these lines. I was a bit worried that the colored pencil would be permanent, but it faded over time just like chalk would, so 10 out of 10 would recommend using a colored pencil. So after getting all of the pattern pieces pinned down, underneath the fabric that is, I am tracing out all of these lines. I think there was close to 100 lines. I don't know. I didn't really count them. I wouldn't be surprised if there was more than 100. It took forever. And I actually didn't end up using these lines exactly when I was sewing my boning channels. I had traced them at a 1/4 inch apart, but it turned out that the zip ties that I used were a little thicker than a 1/4 of an inch. So I used the edge of my presser for it, which was a little bit wider, and it was okay. But I don't know, this took forever. It was still really helpful to have them though, especially for the pieces where the lines weren't straight up and down. Okay, so for underneath, I'm going to be using this canvas. I mean, I ordered it and it said it was canvas, but like, it's not very stiff. So I'm going to do like 2 layers
double it up.
And then when it came time to cut out the other 2 layers of canvas, I did not want to trace all of these pattern pieces again, so I just laid out my interlining canvas layers that I'd already cut out on top and cut around those. You'll notice that my seam allowance is all over the place here. I made it much larger than I usually would, and I didn't take the time to measure it out. I did this because while I'm working with all the boning channels, the edges are going to get really frayed, and the 3 layers of fabric are also going to shift a little bit, so they won't match up exactly. So my plan is to leave them like this, and then when I go to sew it together, I'll trim down all the seam allowances to a nice 1/2 inch, and everything will be lined up and not frayed, and it'll be much easier for me to sew it together. This was also important for around the tabs at the bottom, because they're going to get cut right on that line, no seam allowance. So if I had cut it now, they would have just been a frayed mess, and it would have been almost impossible to sew on the binding afterwards. And once all the pattern pieces were cut out, it was time for the exciting part, sewing. So I started by flatlining the shoulder pieces together. I did this by machine because there were a lot of layers and my fingers were not going to survive through that. And also I flatlined around because these don't have burning channels, and I wanted the pieces to stay together until they were sewn on. And then it was time to sew the boning channels. The process of sewing all of these took over a week. I was exhausted, my neck hurt, but I did it. Anyway, so when I was sewing these, I started in the center line, and worked my way out. I did this so that if the fabric shifted while sewing the channels, as I knew it would, I wouldn't lose any of that fabric. So if I had sewed from one side to the other, by the time I got to the other side, the fabric would have shifted off grain, and there might not have even been enough seam allowance to sew the channels, so this way it was just much easier. So these are the bones that I used. Well, they're not actual bones. When I first started this project, I really wanted to use synthetic whalebone, but then looking at the cost, I realized that that was not realistic for me, for a fully boned bodice. So maybe next time, but I got these cable tied zip ties. I don't know which one they're called, but I got them off Amazon. I'll put a link below. I started off with just these 14 or 15 inches, but I ended up having to get longer ones. I think if I had gotten the right size from the beginning, I would have only had to use one bag, even though I ended up buying 3 different bags, so I'm going to look into returning one. But yeah, don't make the same mistake as me. Although it was cutting it really close. And then began the long, exhausting process of inserting all of the boning into all of the channels. This took forever. It was a painful process too. I don't know, I was not expecting that. I feel like I'm being super dramatic here, but putting putting the bones into the channels took like a level of strength that I did not have, and I got tired really quickly. Also, my fingers got so sore from the sanding and the cutting, and I got blisters. Not a fun process, but I do really love the result, so probably would do again. The actual process for each bone, I am laying it down over the channel and then cutting it down 1/2 inch shorter on either side. If it's on a seam that is at an angle, I try to cut the bone at an angle. And then I take it, file it down with this nail file I have. You could probably also use sandpaper or whatever's handy, and then push it into the channel. This clip is from my very first piece that I did, but so it was like a little slow, a little clunky, but by the time I got to the last piece, it was super fast, super efficient. I really got my flow down.
Okay, so the underbodice is mostly boned. These are bad examples. Some of the channels were too long for the bones that I got, so I have to order more. but a lot of them I got fully boned, and my fingers really hurt from that project, so I'm going to move on to something a lot softer and work on the chemise. Okay, so these are the different pieces. This is the body. These are the sleeves. So in the original pattern, it was not this long, obviously, and then it tapered in at the wrist. But I made them a lot longer, a lot wider, so I can gather them. These are going to be the gores for the side, and these are going to be the underarm gussets or gores. I always forget which ones work.
So I forgot to mention it in that clip, but I will link below the pattern that I ended up using for the chemise. I actually used 2 different patterns because halfway through I realized that I was using the wrong one, but I'll talk about that in a second. Anyway, so here I am cutting out the gussets for the underarms. I'm just taking the little squares, drawing a line on the bias, and then cutting them out. And then I went and attached them to the sleeve. The first time I did this, I attached it in the wrong direction, but then I got it figured out. They attach to the end of the sleeve that goes against the body. I did it so it was like one was against the body, one was at the cuff, but we got it all figured out. It all worked out. Just a little bit of seam ripping. But honestly, what's a project without a little bit of seam ripping? And then I repeated the process for the side gores. I think these are the gores and the other ones are the gussets. If anyone knows the difference between the two, please explain it to me because I still don't know. I ended up having to use 2 rulers because my one wasn't long enough, but I again drew a line on the bias connecting from corner to corner and then cut it out and attached it to the body piece. The wider end of the triangles are at the hem and they taper up to the point towards as you go up the body. So the chemise is widest at the hem and then gets more fitted under the chemise is widest at the hem and then becomes more fitted under the arms. And then here I am just sewing it down. Super simple, just a straight seam. For the chemise, I used a cotton lawn fabric, which I will link down below. I wanted to use a linen, which would be more historically accurate, but again, that wasn't in my price range. This fabric is soft, 100% cotton, so it's nice against my skin, and I think it acts in a similar way to the linens that they would use in history, so it's good enough for me. And then I didn't put in all the clips of me ironing my seams, but I do iron all my seams. Please, please, please iron your seams. It just makes your projects look so much nicer. I iron them flat, and then I iron the seam open from the inside, and then I flip it around and iron it one more time from the outside, so each seam gets ironed 3 times.
Okay, so I'm at this point where the sleeves are all gathered, and it's like a big t-shirt, I guess. But I don't think it's right for this style of chemise because it's not going to be off the shoulder. It's going to sit up, like, if this is the neckline, then this sits on the shoulder. So I think I need to take it apart and try again.
So once I got all of that seam ripped, all of the work I just did, I went back, got the chemise. I started by ripping it along the center. This is how I cut out all the pieces. I didn't mention this before, but they're all ripped because the way this fabric is woven, when you rip it, it stays on grain. And then I am just pinning it. I'm following the instructions from the second link, the second chemise link. So there's more, the sleeves are pinned further down on one than the other. But here you can see what I was saying before, how there's a big rectangle of open space at the top, and that's basically the neckline. So you can see it here. The sleeves become the neckline, and that allows it to sit off the shoulder. And mine is really, really big, which will allow it to be gathered down. And then I did not film any of it in between because I wasn't feeling well, but I sewed up the side seams, and here I am attaching I think it was a 2-inch band around the neckline slash shoulder area.
I took the seam allowance from the strip and I folded it to the inside. From the outside it just looks finished. Okay, I'm going to turn up the edge probably about 1/4 inch and then attach it with I haven't decided what stitch yet, but a hand stitch. Okay, so with the boned underbodice, it's been meeting a few problems. This piece is done. Perfect, incredible. There's 2 different problems with them. With like this piece, they were too long. They were too long for the bones that I had, so I had to get new bones. I already put one in here, but you can see that the new bone is thicker than the older one, so I have to re-sew the boning channels to fit it. And then the other issue is, like with this one, the boning channel isn't big enough to fit even the smaller bone. So I have to go back and re-sew that one too.
So after getting all of the vertical bones in place, there were still a few pieces that had horizontal bones, mainly the center back, the center front, and the side front pieces. So the solution that I found online for these, because at first I was like, I don't know what to do. I can't sew through the bones. The solution I found online was to create a pocket piece that sits on top of them, and then you can put the horizontal bones in the pocket, and you get that support without having to sew into your other bones. So I started by tracing, I went back to my pattern pieces, I went back to my interlining lightweight canvas from the beginning of the video, and I basically just repeated the process of cutting out the 3 layers of canvas and sewing them together to make a pocket. This time I did trace the pieces from above because I didn't need all the lines, so I just traced them out normally. And then it was time to put the bones in. This obviously didn't take as long as putting the bones in the main pieces, but I was so tired at this point. Anyway, the same process, I cut them down, filed them, put them in, and now I am turning over the seam allowance, and I ended up grading the seam allowance, so I cut away the 2 underlayers so that it wasn't as thick. And then I folded over the top layer, pinned it down, and stitched it. And then once that was stitched, I basted it on top of the vertical bone piece. I matched up the seams that were marked on both and basted it down.
Okay, I'm not sure where I last updated, but it's all sewn together now. I don't think I got any clips of it because I just started sewing and it went together so quickly. I've spent like 2 or 3 weeks sewing all the boning panels. And for some reason, I thought sewing this whole thing together was going to be some big scary thing. But no, it was really easy. I just trimmed down the seam allowance, sewed it together, pressed it open. I have this like big pile of seam allowances now. yeah, I got excited and I already did one of the seam allowances, and then I realized I should probably record how I do that, but I'm so happy. I like tried it on just over my clothes real quick, and I freaked out for a second because it was too tight around the hips. But then I realized that's because I haven't cut the slits into it yet. I did the same thing with the mock-up. I tried to try it on before cutting the slits, and of course it wouldn't fit yet. So yeah, I'm just gonna go through. You can see the like little pockets where the horizontal bones were, but I'm gonna go through and do all the seam allowances, and yeah.
So the process for finishing the seam allowances is pretty simple. I grade down the seam allowances, so I cut the bottom one right at the edge, I cut the middle one about halfway down the seam allowance, and I leave the top one so that I can fold it around and encase the others in a felled seam, and I just pin it down. I'm not sure if this is the historically accurate way to do it, um, but I didn't want to leave these seams raw because it just felt like they would fray so much over time, and I thought the bone bodice looked so pretty from the other side. I wanted it to look pretty from this side too. But yeah, I'm just pinning it down, and then I go through and secure it with a whip stitch. Um, this was a little difficult because I couldn't hold the bodice while I was sewing because the fabric didn't really bend like that, so I had to do it flat on the table. So it was a little hard to maneuver. And also I'm sad because especially around where the pockets are for the horizontal boning, the seam allowance isn't the neatest. But again, it's on the inside of a structural piece of the garment, so it's not like it's a big flaw that will show up when I wear it. And here it is, all finished. You can see the inside, and then I'll flip it around and show the outside. I am so happy with how this project turned out, and it's making me really excited to work on the rest of it because it's starting to really move now instead of just doing bones for 3 weeks. I'm sorry this video is a little long. It's 3 weeks of content instead of 1 week. But yeah, if you're interested in seeing the rest of this project, check out my other videos on it and consider subscribing to see where I go with it in the future. Bye!